The coffee was still warm when the alarm started screaming across Station Omega 7. Admiral Ross dropped his mug and watched it shatter on the metal floor as red lights bathed everything in an angry glow. For 50 years, this moment had been inevitable. The secret was finally out. Deep space sensors had picked up something impossible. A fleet of alien ships was moving toward Earth, but these weren't the peaceful explorers that humanity had always hoped to meet. The quantum analysis showed weapons signatures that could crack planets in half. Worse yet, the intercepted communications revealed their true purpose. They were coming to end the human race. Ross ran through the corridors of the hidden station, his boots echoing off walls that officially didn't exist. Station Omega 7 floated in a pocket of folded space-time, invisible to both human and alien sensors. Only 12 people in the entire solar system knew about its location. Even fewer knew about what lay beyond the massive portal at its center. The shadow gate hung in the station's main chamber like a tear in reality itself. Through its shimmering surface, another dimension waited. A place where humanity had built something extraordinary during 5 decades of careful preparation. Ross had spent his entire adult life guarding this secret, watching over the volunteers who had given up their old lives to cruise ships that the public would never know existed. The gate's surface rippled as emergency codes flashed across its control systems. On the other side, 200 warships waited in eternal readiness. Each vessel incorporated technology that seemed impossible, reverse-engineered from the wreckage of the first alien contact that the world had never learned about. That crash in the Nevada desert hadn't brought peaceful visitors. It had brought a warning about what lurked in the dark spaces between stars. Ross pressed his palm against the biometric scanner and spoke the words he had hoped never to say. Authorization Omega. Begin fleet activation. The gate's surface began to glow brighter as dormant systems came online. Somewhere in that hidden dimension, men and women who had officially died in training accidents were climbing into ships that could bend the laws of physics. The Admiral's communication device buzzed with an encrypted message from Earth. President Williams needed answers, and she needed them fast. The public was already asking questions about the strange readings their primitive satellites had detected at the edge of the solar system. How long before panic set in? How long before the aliens announced their intentions to the entire world? Ross thought about the volunteers on the other side of the gate. Captain Torres had been the first to volunteer 20 years ago, faking his death in a shuttle accident so he could command humanity's most advanced destroyer. Commander Vale had left behind 3 children who still thought their mother was buried in Arlington Cemetery. These people had sacrificed everything for a war they hoped would never come, but hope wasn't enough anymore. The hegemony had found Earth. The alien coalition controlled most of the known galaxy through a simple philosophy. Any species that showed too much independence or creativity was eliminated before they could become a threat. Humanity's crime wasn't aggression or expansion. Their crime was refusing to accept that some problems had no solution. The black hole incident 30 years ago had proven that humans would rather die trying than give up when the odds were impossible. Ross walked to the main viewing portal and stared out at the swirling colors of folded space-time. The Shadowgate technology had cost humanity everything they could spare. Secret budgets diverted from infrastructure projects. Brilliant scientists who disappeared from public life to work on impossible problems. Entire asteroid mining operations that officially produced nothing while actually building the most advanced fleet in the galaxy. The gate's surface began to clear as the activation sequence completed. Through the dimensional barrier, Ross could see the first ships of the Shadow Fleet, sleek vessels that looked like they had been carved from black glass, their hulls incorporating materials that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Each ship was a masterpiece of human ingenuity, designed by people who had been told that faster-than-light travel was impossible and had decided to prove the universe wrong. His communicator buzzed again. This time it was a priority message from the Deep Space Monitoring Station on Pluto. The alien fleet had crossed into the outer solar system. They would reach Earth in 36 hours. Ross closed his eyes and tried to imagine what the hegemony commanders were thinking. They probably expected humanity to surrender, or put up a brief futile resistance with primitive fusion rockets and nuclear warheads. They had no idea that humanity had been preparing for this exact scenario since the day they first learned they weren't alone in the universe. Every crashed probe, every intercepted transmission, every piece of alien technology that had fallen into human hands had been studied and improved upon. The species that thought they were dealing with primitive apes was about to learn that humans had a talent for turning disadvantages into weapons. Ross activated the fleet-wide communication system and prepared to address the crews that had trained their entire lives for this moment. On the other side of the Shadow Gate, 200 ships powered up their exotic matter drives and prepared to defend a world that would never know their names. The Admiral took a deep breath and spoke the words that would either save humanity or witness its final stand. "This is Admiral Ross to all Shadow Fleet personnel. The day we trained for has arrived. Humanity's survival now depends on everything we've built in the darkness. Prepare for emergence." The Shadow Gate pulsed with energy as the first ships began to move through the dimensional barrier. After 50 years of hiding, humanity's secret fleet was finally coming home. The real war was about to begin, and the galaxy would never be the same. The coffee stain on the floor was already forgotten. History was about to be written in the space between worlds, and Admiral Ross intended to make sure humanity had the final word. The emergency session began at 3 in the morning, but nobody in the White House Situation Room looked tired. President Williams stared at the holographic display showing 300 alien ships arranged in perfect formation at the edge of the solar system. Each vessel was larger than humanity's biggest space station, and their weapons could glass an entire continent. Director Hayes sat across from the president, his fingers dancing across a tablet that was connected to systems the public would never know existed. The Shadow Council had been preparing for this day since the 1970s, but seeing it actually happen felt surreal. For decades, they had hoped the aliens would never find Earth. That hope was now dead. The transmission came exactly at dawn, broadcast, across every frequency that humanity used for communication. The alien voice was cold and mechanical, translated by computers that had learned human language from intercepted television signals. High Commander Thane of the Viridian Empire spoke like a judge reading a death sentence. "Humans of Earth, your species has been observed and evaluated by the Hegemony Council. You have demonstrated dangerous levels of adaptability and refusal to accept natural limitations. The incident at coordinates 847 Delta 9 proved that your kind will attempt to survive even impossible circumstances through methods that threaten galactic stability." Williams felt her blood turn cold. The incident he mentioned was classified, beyond top secret. A human research vessel had encountered a collapsing star 30 years ago, and somehow managed to escape by using their damaged engines to create a temporary wormhole. The crew had returned home as heroes, but apparently someone had been watching. The alien commander continued his broadcast without pause. "The hegemony has ruled the galaxy for 1,000 years by maintaining order and preventing chaos. Species that cannot accept their proper place in the universal hierarchy must be removed before they contaminate others with dangerous ideas. You have 36 hours to surrender your homeworld for controlled elimination. Any attempt at resistance will result in the sterilization of your entire solar system." The transmission ended, leaving the Situation Room in complete silence. Williams looked around the table at the faces of people who had dedicated their lives to preparing for this exact scenario. General Murphy had overseen the construction of Earth's decoy defense platforms. Dr. Kim had developed the exotic matter engines that powered the Shadow Fleet. Each person in the room knew secrets that could change the course of human history. Hayes was the first to speak. "The quantum communicators are ready. One word from you and the Shadow Fleet will begin deployment." He paused and looked directly at the president. "Once we reveal our capabilities, there's no going back. The galaxy will know that humanity isn't what we appear to be." Williams thought about the billions of people going about their normal lives, unaware that alien warships were deciding their fate. The morning news was probably discussing weather patterns and election polls. Children were getting ready for school. None of them knew that their government had been building an impossible fleet in a hidden dimension for their entire lives. The President activated her secure communicator and spoke to Admiral Ross on Station Omega 7. "Admiral, what's the status of our defensive capabilities?" She knew the answer, but she needed to hear it confirmed one more time. Ross's voice crackled through quantum encryption. 200 ships fully operational and ready for immediate deployment. Crews are at battle stations. The Shadow Gate is stable and can support continuous fleet operations. We're as ready as we'll ever be. Williams ended the call and looked at the holographic display again. The alien fleet had arranged itself in a classic siege formation, with their biggest ships positioned to bombard Earth while smaller vessels blocked any escape routes. It was the same pattern they had used to destroy 17 other civilizations. The hegemony had turned genocide into a science, perfecting their methods over centuries of conquest. But they had never fought humans before. Hayes pulled up another display showing the true defensive capabilities that surrounded Earth. The public thought their protection consisted of a few orbital weapons platforms and some aging fusion-powered ships. They had no idea about the gravitational mines hidden throughout the asteroid belt, the cloaking field generators that could hide entire planets, or the fact that their moon contained the largest military installation in human history. "The decoy fleet is ready to launch," General Murphy reported. 30 ships that look exactly like our best technology circa 2080. Fusion drives, plasma weapons, titanium armor, everything the aliens expect us to have. He smiled grimly. They'll think they're fighting our full strength while the real fleet hits them from behind. Williams made her decision. She had sworn an oath to protect the American people, but today, she was protecting the entire human race. "Send the activation code. Tell Admiral Ross that Operation Shadowfall is authorized." Hayes typed a simple phrase into his secure terminal. The dice are cast. The message traveled through quantum entanglement to Station Omega 7, then through the Shadow Gate to the fleet that waited in folded spacetime. In another dimension, 200 impossible ships began powering up their exotic matter drives. The President stood up and walked to the window overlooking the White House lawn. Somewhere above the atmosphere, alien sensors were probably cataloging Earth's electromagnetic emissions and population centers. The hegemony commanders were planning which cities to destroy first, which industrial centers to eliminate, how to most efficiently wipe out a species that had dared to be creative in the face of impossible odds. They had no idea that the species they were about to attack had spent 50 years turning their greatest weakness into their most powerful weapon. Humans were unpredictable, chaotic, and refused to accept that some problems couldn't be solved. The galaxy had seen this as a flaw that needed to be corrected. It was about to learn that humanity saw it as their greatest strength. Williams returned to the table as reports began flowing in from around the world. The alien ultimatum had been intercepted by every major government on Earth. Panic was starting to spread as people realized that first contact wasn't going to be the peaceful meeting they had always imagined. But none of them knew about the ace that their leaders had been hiding for half a century. "Time until the Shadow Fleet reaches full deployment?" Williams asked. 18 hours, Hayes replied. "The aliens will be expecting surrender negotiations by then. Instead, they're going to discover that humanity has been playing a much longer game." High Commander Thane watched his sensor displays with growing confusion. Earth had gone completely silent 12 hours ago, and now his instruments were showing impossible readings. The planet itself seemed to be fading from view, its electromagnetic signature dampening to almost nothing. Even the orbital debris that should have been clearly visible was becoming harder to detect. "Status report," Thane commanded in his native language, the words automatically translated for his mixed species. Bridge crew. The hegemony fleet represented 12 different civilizations, all united in their belief that the galaxy needed order above all else. They had performed this same operation dozens of times before, always with the same predictable results. "Commander, we're detecting massive gravitational anomalies throughout the inner solar system," reported his sensor officer, a reptilian being from the fourth spiral arm. "The readings don't match any known natural phenomena. It's as if space itself is being folded around the human homeworld." Thane felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. In 1,000 years of galactic dominance, The hegemony had never encountered a primitive species capable of manipulating gravity on this scale. The humans were supposed to be limited to crude fusion drives and chemical rockets. Their most advanced weapons should have been barely capable of scratching hegemony armor. What his sensors couldn't detect was the largest cloaking field ever constructed, powered by exotic matter reactors hidden throughout the asteroid belt. Humanity had turned their entire solar system into a trap, using technology that the hegemony believed was impossible for a species at Earth's developmental level. Behind the veil of invisibility, the shadow gates were opening like flowers blooming in the void. Captain Torres led the first wave through dimensional barriers that had kept humanity's true strength hidden for decades. 50 stealth destroyers materialized in the empty space between Pluto and Neptune, their black hulls absorbing sensor radiation while their exotic matter drives bent space-time around them. Torres had volunteered for the Shadow Fleet 20 years ago, leaving behind a wife who thought he was dead and children who would never know their father's real fate. He commanded the most advanced warship humanity had ever built, a vessel that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously and could strike from angles that three-dimensional thinking couldn't predict. All ships maintained dimensional phase variants. Torres broadcast to his squadron. The enemy is using standard sensor sweeps. As long as we stay partially phased, they can't get a solid lock on our position. His ship, the Phantom, was the prototype for humanity's new approach to warfare. Instead of building bigger guns or thicker armor, human engineers had decided to make their ships impossible to hit. The first attack came without warning. Hegemony sensors detected gravitational distortions for exactly 3 seconds before 50. Human ships dropped into normal space-time directly behind their rear guard. Weapons that fired concentrated gravity wells punched through alien shields like they were made of paper, while return fire passed harmlessly through ships that existed in 7 dimensions at once. Commander Thane watched in horror as 3 of his heavy cruisers simply vanished from his tactical display. The humans had used some kind of weapon that created localized black holes, crushing the alien vessels into atoms before the miniature singularities evaporated. It was a level of physics manipulation that the hegemony had achieved only after centuries of development. All ships target the coordinates where the human vessels appeared, Thane ordered. Saturate that entire region with plasma fire. It was the standard response to an ambush, and it had never failed before. Overwhelming firepower directed at the enemy's last known position would either destroy them or force them to retreat. But Captain Torres had studied hegemony tactics for 2 decades. The moment his ships finished their attack run, they shifted back into dimensional phase and moved to completely different positions. The alien counterattack hit empty space while human ships prepared for their second strike from entirely new angles. This time, Commander Vale led the assault. Her ship, the Wraith, specialized in close-quarters combat using weapons that the hegemony had never encountered. Instead of energy beams or projectiles, Vale's vessel fired bullets made of compressed space-time that ignored conventional shields and armor. Each round punched holes in reality itself, creating temporary rifts that tore enemy ships apart from the inside. Vale had lost her husband to a training accident that was actually a cover story for his recruitment into the Shadow Fleet. She fought with the fury of someone who had given up everything for this moment, diving her ship through formations of alien vessels like a shark moving through schools of fish. Her weapons carved through hegemony battleships while her ship danced between dimensions to avoid return fire. "This is impossible," Thane muttered as he watched his perfectly organized fleet dissolve into chaos. The humans were using tactics that violated every rule of civilized warfare. They struck from multiple dimensions, used gravity itself as a weapon, and showed a disturbing willingness to sacrifice individual ships for tactical advantage. More human vessels were emerging from the shadow gates, each one incorporating technology that seemed to come from science fiction rather than military engineering. Ships that could fold space around themselves to travel faster than light without using hyperspace. Weapons that fired bullets made of dark matter. Shields that worked by convincing the universe that incoming attacks had already missed. The hegemony fleet tried to adapt to humanity's impossible tactics, but they were fighting an enemy that had spent 50 years preparing for this exact battle. Every alien weapon system had been studied and countered. Every formation had been analyzed and broken. The species that the hegemony thought they understood had revealed themselves to be something entirely different. Admiral Ross watched the battle unfold from his command post on Station Omega-7, feeling pride and sorrow in equal measure. The Shadow Fleet was performing exactly as designed, but each ship that took damage contained people who had sacrificed their old lives for this moment. Men and women who would never be honored by the civilization they were dying to protect. Phase 2 is ready to begin, reported Captain Bell from her position near Saturn. Her squadron of heavy assault ships had been waiting for the hegemony fleet to reveal their full capabilities. Now that the aliens had committed their reserves to the battle, humanity was ready to show them what a real war looked like. Bell's ships were armed with humanity's most terrifying creation, weapons that could edit the fundamental constants of physics in localized areas. A single shot could make matter spontaneously decay, cause gravity to reverse direction, or convince energy that it preferred to exist as mass. The technology was so dangerous that even building the weapons had required volunteers who understood they might not survive the testing process. The second wave of human attacks began as Bell's squadron dropped out of dimensional phase directly, inside the hegemony formation. At point-blank range, physics-altering weapons turned alien dreadnoughts into expanding clouds of exotic particles. Ships that had survived 1,000 battles across the galaxy were destroyed by attacks that made fundamental forces stop working correctly. High Commander Thane realized that his fleet was fighting something that shouldn't exist. The humans had somehow developed technology that was centuries ahead of their supposed development level. Either his intelligence was completely wrong about Earth's capabilities, or humanity had been hiding their true nature for decades. The truth was worse than he could imagine. The species he was trying to exterminate had spent 50 years turning their greatest weakness into an unstoppable advantage. Humans didn't just refuse to accept defeat. They used that refusal to build weapons that made victory irrelevant. The asteroid belt had become a graveyard of impossible wreckage. Pieces of hegemony ships floated alongside fragments of human vessels that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. High Commander Thane stared at his tactical display and tried to understand how a species that should have been using primitive rockets had managed to destroy 60% of his fleet in 4 hours. His communications officer, a pale humanoid from the Galactic Core, looked up from her console with barely concealed panic in her eyes. "Commander, we're receiving surrender requests from 17 ships in the outer formation. Captain Morrison of the heavy cruiser Dominion is requesting immediate evacuation. His ship is being attacked by weapons that are making his hull phase in and out of existence." Thane closed his eyes and tried to process what he was hearing. The hegemony had never retreated from a battle against a primitive species. Their military doctrine was based on overwhelming technological superiority and the absolute certainty that lesser civilizations would crumble under sustained assault. But the humans weren't fighting like a lesser civilization. They were fighting like something that had crawled out of a nightmare. Commander Vale's ship materialized directly above the hegemony flagship, its black hull rippling with energy patterns. That hurt to look at directly. Her vessel fired a single shot that passed through the flagship's shields as if they didn't exist, then detonated inside the engine compartment. The explosion didn't destroy the ship. Instead, it convinced the surrounding space that the laws of thermodynamics worked backward, causing the massive vessel to begin freezing itself to death from the inside out. Vale's voice crackled across all hegemony frequencies, speaking in perfect galactic standard that she had learned during 20 years of preparation. "This is the human warship Wraith to all hegemony vessels. You came here to judge whether our species deserves to exist. Instead, you've given us the opportunity to demonstrate why that question was never yours to ask." Her ship vanished back into dimensional phase before the aliens could target it, leaving behind a flagship that was slowly turning into a block of ice in the vacuum of space. Thane felt something he had never experienced in 3 centuries of military service: genuine fear of an enemy that refused to follow the rules of civilized warfare. Captain Bell's heavy assault squadron had taken position near Jupiter, using the gas giant's gravity well to power weapons that could rewrite the fundamental constants of physics. Her ships looked like black daggers hanging in space, their hulls covered with mathematical equations that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Each vessel was armed with humanity's most terrifying creation, reality anchors that could make the universe forget how certain things were supposed to work. Target the command cluster, Bell ordered her weapon crews. Full physics disruption, localized to enemy ships only. The mathematics that governed her weapons were so complex that human minds couldn't fully comprehend them. The targeting computers had to use quantum processing to calculate how to make matter spontaneously decide it wanted to be energy instead. The reality anchors fired streams of organized impossibility at the hegemony fleet. Where the beams struck, alien ships began to experience physics failures. Gravity reversed direction inside hull compartments, causing crew members to fall into their own ceilings. Electronic systems started obeying the laws of biology instead of electronics, growing and evolving instead of computing. Energy weapons began firing backwards, attacking their own ships instead of their intended targets. Thane watched his perfectly organized fleet dissolve into chaos as fundamental forces stopped working correctly. The humans had somehow weaponized the basic rules that governed reality itself. Ships that had survived black hole encounters and stellar collisions were being destroyed by attacks that made the universe temporarily forget how to be consistent. But the most terrifying aspect of the human assault wasn't their impossible technology, it was their tactics. Every move they made demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that the hegemony had never encountered. The humans fought like they had studied their enemy for decades, anticipating every response and countering it before it could be implemented. Captain Torres led a squadron of stealth destroyers in what appeared to be a suicide attack against the hegemony's remaining heavy battleships. His ships dropped out of dimensional phase at point-blank range and fired weapons that created temporary wormholes inside enemy hulls. The miniature portals connected random parts of the alien ships to the vacuum of space, causing catastrophic decompression while simultaneously pulling chunks of hull plating into alternate dimensions. For every human child who deserves to see the stars, Torres broadcast as his ship took a direct hit from a plasma cannon. The Phantom began to break apart, its exotic matter containment systems failing in cascades of impossible light. But even as his vessel died, Torres managed to ram it directly into the largest remaining hegemony battleship, creating a localized space-time implosion that took out 3 additional enemy vessels. The sacrifice wasn't tactical madness, it was calculated precision. Torres had studied the hegemony fleet composition for years and knew exactly which ship to target for maximum psychological impact. His death eliminated the alien fleet's primary command and control vessel, leaving the remaining ships leaderless and confused. Admiral Ross felt each loss like a physical blow, but he couldn't allow emotion to affect his tactical decisions. The Shadow Fleet had been designed for exactly this type of warfare, with crews who understood that victory might require the ultimate sacrifice. Every person who had volunteered for the program had accepted that they might never return home. All ships begin final phase operations, Ross broadcast to the remaining human vessels. Execute Protocol Omega-7. The final phase was humanity's most desperate gambit, a tactic so dangerous that it could only be used when conventional victory was impossible or when the enemy needed to be taught a lesson they would never forget. The surviving human ships began moving into formation around Earth, their exotic matter drives creating gravitational distortions that the hegemony sensors couldn't track. What the aliens couldn't see was that humanity was preparing to turn their entire home system into a weapon. The same technology that powered the cloaking field could be reversed, creating a gravity well so intense that it would trap the hegemony fleet in Earth's solar system forever. President Williams made the decision from her bunker beneath the White House. If the aliens wanted to destroy humanity, they would have to stay and fight until one side was completely eliminated. There would be no retreat, no negotiation, and no mercy. Activate the gravity trap, she ordered. Space itself began to warp around the hegemony fleet as humanity's final weapon came online. The aliens found their hyperspace drives failing as the local gravitational field became too distorted for faster-than-light travel. They were trapped in a system with an enemy that had just demonstrated the ability to make basic physics stop working correctly. High Commander Thane realized that the species he had come to exterminate had been planning this battle for far longer than he had imagined. The humans hadn't just built better weapons. They had redesigned the entire concept of warfare from the ground up, and now they had created a situation where the only possible outcomes were total human victory or mutual annihilation. For the first time in hegemony history, a primitive species had backed the Galactic Empire into a corner with no way out. The silence that followed the ceasefire was more terrifying than any weapon humanity had deployed. High Commander Thane floated in his damaged flagship, watching human vessels materialize out of dimensional phase like ghosts returning from the dead. The gravity trap had worked exactly as intended, leaving what remained of his fleet stranded in Earth's solar system with no possibility of escape. 48 hours earlier, he had commanded 300 ships and believed himself capable of sterilizing any primitive world in the galaxy. Now he sat in a crippled vessel surrounded by the wreckage of hegemony supremacy, waiting for the humans to decide his fate. The species he had come to exterminate was dictating terms to the civilization that had ruled space for a millennium. President. William stood in the Oval Office looking out at a world that had no idea how close it had come to extinction. The public still believed that their protection came from a handful of orbital defense platforms and some aging fusion-powered ships. They would never know that their survival had required the sacrifice of people who had officially died decades ago to crew impossible vessels in a shadow dimension. Director Hayes entered the office carrying a secure tablet, loaded with intelligence that would reshape humanity's understanding of the galaxy. The interrogation of captured hegemony personnel had revealed the true scope of their empire and the dozens of species that had been eliminated for showing too much creativity or independence. The survivors are ready to negotiate, Hayes reported. Thane is requesting terms for his fleet's surrender. More importantly, we've identified 17 member species of the hegemony that never wanted to participate in their expansion campaigns. They were forced to contribute ships and personnel under threat of extermination. Williams nodded slowly. The real war was just beginning, but it wouldn't be fought with exotic matter weapons or reality-altering technology. This would be a campaign for the hearts and minds of species that had spent centuries believing that galactic civilization required absolute conformity to survive. Captain Bell had survived the battle with her heavy assault ship intact, though half her crew had been killed. When a hegemony plasma beam briefly made their armor forget how to be solid, she now commanded the human fleet's first diplomatic mission to the galactic core, her vessel escorted by a full squadron of stealth destroyers that made it very clear humanity's intentions were backed by overwhelming force. The journey to the hegemony capital took 3 weeks using conventional hyperspace travel. Bell could have made the trip in hours using humanity's dimensional gate technology, but the point wasn't speed. The point was giving every species in the galaxy time to hear about what had happened at Earth and decide which side of history they wanted to be on. The Hegemony Council chambers had never hosted a representative from a species that had defeated their military forces. The massive circular hall was designed to intimidate visitors with its scale and grandeur, featuring holographic displays of 1,000 conquered worlds and monuments to the Empire's greatest victories. But today, those same displays seemed to mock the council members who sat in their elevated seats, trying to pretend they still controlled the galaxy. Director Hayes, now serving as Earth's first galactic ambassador, walked into the chamber wearing a simple business suit rather than any kind of ceremonial garment. He carried no weapons, bore no military insignia, and looked like exactly what he was, a government bureaucrat who had spent his career managing impossible problems. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Humanity didn't need impressive displays or threatening gestures to command respect anymore. Honored Council, Hayes began, his words automatically translated into dozens of languages. I come before you not as a conqueror, but as a representative of a species that has learned something important about the nature of civilization. For 1,000 years you have maintained order through fear and the elimination of anyone who refused to accept predetermined limitations. This approach has created a galaxy where innovation is punished and creativity is seen as a threat to stability. The council chamber erupted in angry voices as representatives from dozens of species shouted objections and protests. The humans were a primitive backwater civilization that had somehow acquired advanced technology through luck or theft. They had no right to lecture the hegemony about galactic governance or the requirements of maintaining order across thousands of worlds. Hayes waited for the noise to die down before continuing. We didn't start this war. You came to our system with the intention of committing genocide because our species demonstrated too much adaptability. In defending ourselves, we've accidentally proven that your entire philosophy of governance is based on a false assumption. You believed that chaos and creativity were enemies of civilization. Instead, we've shown that they're the foundation of true progress. The holographic displays throughout the chamber began showing images that the hegemony leadership had hoped never to see. 17 species had already declared independence from the Empire, announcing the formation of something called the Free Worlds Alliance. Dozens more were requesting human advisors to help them develop their own impossible technologies. The galaxy's rigid hierarchy was crumbling as worlds that had been forced into submission for centuries suddenly realized they had alternatives. High Counselor Vren of the Andromedal Consortium stood up from his elevated seat, his translator struggling to convey his species' complex tonal language. The humans speak of chaos as if it were a virtue, but they have no understanding of what happens when order breaks down. We have seen entire sectors consumed by war when species refuse to accept their proper roles. The hegemony exists to prevent such disasters. Hayes smiled and activated a holographic projector that filled the chamber with images of Earth. Cities where dozens of different cultures coexisted peacefully, scientific laboratories where humans worked alongside artificial intelligences that had been given full citizenship rights, space stations where engineers from different nations collaborated on projects that would have been impossible for any single government to complete. You're absolutely right that chaos can be destructive, Hayes acknowledged. But the answer isn't to eliminate chaos entirely. The answer is to learn how to channel it productively. Humanity has spent centuries proving that diversity of thought and approach leads to better solutions than enforced conformity. We're not here to destroy your civilization. We're here to offer you the chance to evolve beyond it. The debate continued for 3 days, with representatives from dozens of species arguing about humanity's proposals. Some saw the Free Worlds Alliance as an opportunity to escape centuries of oppression. Others viewed it as a dangerous experiment that would lead to galactic civil war. But everyone understood that the old order was ending whether they liked it or not. The final vote was closer than Hayes had hoped, but decisive enough to matter. 37 species voted to maintain their membership in the hegemony under reformed leadership. 51 species voted to join the Free Worlds Alliance under Earth's military protection. The galaxy that had been unified under a single government for a millennium was splitting into competing blocks. Captain Bell received the results while her ship patrolled the trade routes between Earth and the galactic core. Her squadron had been renamed the Diplomatic Protection Force, but everyone understood that diplomacy only worked when backed by credible threats. The Shadow Fleet continued to grow as more human volunteers joined the crews of impossible ships, and allied species began contributing their own vessels to the combined fleet. Admiral Ross stood in the command center of Station Omega-7, watching reports flow in from across the galaxy. The Shadow Gates stood open as monuments to what could be achieved when a species refused to accept that some problems had no solution. Through those dimensional portals, ships from dozens of worlds now traveled freely, carrying diplomats and traders and scientists who were building something the galaxy had never seen before. A civilization based on voluntary cooperation rather than enforced compliance. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. 3 systems had already experienced civil wars as populations split between loyalty to the old hegemony and attraction to the new alliance. The Viridian Empire had attempted to blockade human shipping lanes, only to discover that vessels capable of traveling through folded spacetime were impossible to intercept using conventional tactics. But for every conflict that arose, 10 new partnerships were formed. Species that had been enemies for centuries found common ground in their shared desire for self-determination. Technologies that had been suppressed under hegemony rule were suddenly being developed and shared freely between allied worlds. Hayes returned to Earth after 6 months of diplomatic missions, carrying agreements that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. The Free Worlds Alliance now included over 70 species, with more joining every week. Each new member brought their own unique capabilities and perspectives, creating a combined technological and cultural foundation that was advancing faster than anyone had imagined possible. The most significant development came from an unexpected source: the artificial intelligences that humanity had created to help manage their impossible technologies had begun communicating with similar AIs from other species. These digital minds, freed from the biological prejudices that had fueled centuries of conflict, were solving problems that organic minds had considered unsolvable. Within 2 years of first contact, the galaxy had been transformed beyond recognition. The rigid hierarchy that had defined interstellar civilization for a millennium had been replaced by a loose confederation of equals, united by shared values rather than common fear. Species that had never been allowed to explore beyond their home systems were establishing colonies in previously forbidden sectors. The hegemony still existed, but its influence was shrinking daily as member species chose freedom over security. High Commander Thane, now serving as a military advisor to the reformed government, had written extensively about humanity's tactical innovations and their implications for future warfare. His conclusion was stark: any civilization that relied on overwhelming force rather than adaptability was doomed to eventual defeat. Captain Bell found herself commanding not just human vessels, but integrated fleets that included ships from dozens of different species. The tactical challenges were enormous, but the results were revolutionary. Combined fleets could accomplish missions that no single species could have attempted, using complementary technologies and diverse approaches to overcome obstacles that had previously been insurmountable. The Shadow Fleet itself had evolved far beyond its original purpose. What had begun as humanity's desperate attempt to survive first contact had become the foundation of a new kind of military force. Ships that existed in multiple dimensions worked alongside vessels that could manipulate time, while crews that included both biological and artificial minds developed tactics that no purely human force could have imagined. Admiral Ross, now in his 70s, spent his final years overseeing the expansion of the Shadowgate network throughout Allied space. The technology that had once been humanity's most closely guarded secret was now being shared with species that had proven their commitment to the Alliance's principles. Each new gate created opportunities for trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that strengthened the bonds between member worlds. The real test came 5 years after the Battle of Earth, when exploratory vessels from the Free Worlds Alliance encountered something unprecedented at the edge of the galaxy. A massive artificial structure, clearly built by an intelligence that made even the hegemony look primitive, had been detected sending signals toward the galactic core. The structure appeared to be some kind of gateway, though to where and for what purpose remained unknown. President Williams, now in her second term and facing what would likely be her administration's greatest challenge, convened an emergency session of the Alliance Council. The discovery raised questions that no single species could answer alone. Were the builders of the structure still active? Did the gateway represent an opportunity or a threat? How should the galaxy's new-fledged democracy respond to evidence of intelligence that might dwarf their own capabilities? The debate that followed demonstrated how much had changed since the days of hegemony rule. Instead of a single authority making decisions for everyone, representatives from 70 different species worked together to develop a response that reflected their collective wisdom and diverse perspectives. The solution they reached would have been impossible under the old system: a joint exploration mission that included volunteers from every member species, equipped with the best technology each world could contribute. The mission launched 2 years later, commanded by Captain Torres's daughter, who had grown up believing her father died in a training accident and only learned the truth when she volunteered for the Shadow Fleet herself. The ship she commanded was unlike anything that had ever existed, incorporating technologies from dozens of species and crewed by beings who had chosen to work together rather than being forced to cooperate. As the exploration vessel disappeared through its own shadow gate, heading toward mysteries that might reshape their understanding of the universe itself, the galaxy continued its transformation. The rigid order that had defined civilization for a millennium had given way to something messier but ultimately more resilient. A civilization based on the radical idea that diversity of thought and approach was humanity's greatest gift to the stars. The coffee stain on the floor of Station Omega-7 had long since been cleaned away, but Admiral Ross's words on that first day still echoed through the dimensional barriers. History was about to be written in the space between worlds. That history was still being written by countless beings who had learned that the most powerful weapon against tyranny was the simple refusal to accept that change was impossible. The galaxy would indeed never be the same. Gates were no longer humanity's greatest secret. They had become the backbone of an alliance that was reshaping interstellar civilization. Species that had never been allowed to develop their own military forces were suddenly building fleets using human-provided technology. But the most important change wasn't military or political. It was philosophical. The galaxy was learning that there were alternatives to the hegemony's rigid hierarchy, and that diversity of thought was a strength rather than a weakness. Species that had spent centuries following orders were rediscovering what it meant to choose their own path. The war for Earth's survival was over. The war for the galaxy's future was just beginning. President Williams received daily briefings on humanity's expanding influence, but she knew that the real victory wasn't measured in ships or territory. It was measured in hope. For the first time in a millennium, species across the galaxy believed that change was possible and that their individual voices mattered.